This is going to be the Forestry Friday on jumping worms. So today we're going to be talking about biology, history, and management. And I'm Brittany Schappach. I'm an entomologist here with the Maine Forest Service. Happy to just go ahead and get started now. Okay, so lots of ground to cover here. So I just want to make sure that we're going over the basics. So first things first, earthworms are invertebrates, which means that they don't have a backbone. They don't have any bones at all. Typically, we see them living in the soil. They could also live in the water. They're eating decaying roots, things like leaves and bacteria and fungi. You probably recognize some of the worms that are on the screen right here. We've got the red wiggler. This one's often used as a bait fish for fishing. There's also the nightcrawler, also known as the European crawler or the common nightcrawler, which is this guy here. Oh, let me see if you can see. Oh. No, okay. We're trying new things today. The bottom right in your corner, the screen there, is the common nightcrawler. So some things about earthworm biology is there's going to be three defining characteristics about how earthworms are classified. So the first is going to be epigeic. This is going to be the worms that are in the leaf litter layer, so the top like 1 to 3 inches or so. So these are going to be things like your red wigglers. They're good for bait fish, but they're also good for composting if you have a compost pile. So those are going to be in the top layer. Next, we have endogeic. This is your topsoil layer. So these worms go a little bit deeper down, anywhere from 6 inches to 10 inches, I would say. And this is going to be your topsoil. So things like leaf worms would be found on this central layer. Lastly, we have the anisic. So this is the subsoil. These guys go down really far, as far down as 6 feet sometimes, and they typically have vertical burrows. They burrow straight down. This is going to be our common nightcrawler or the European nightcrawler. And so that being said, it's important to note that there are no native earthworms in Maine, and this is because of a glaciation event that happened 10,000 years ago, give or take a couple of years. And this is because there was an ice sheet that was covering most of Maine and most of the Northeast, actually. And so what happened was this ice sheet came over, froze everything. So any earthworms that were here died. And so when this glaciation event actually went away, everything melted, the earthworms that were in the southern parts of the United States were able to migrate upward. And so that's why we have some of the native earthworms native to southern United States actually in Maine and other parts of the Northeast, like New York and Connecticut. But this also means that there is an introduction of invasive worms as well. And so one of the invasive worms that's been a really hot topic lately is jumping worms. And so that's what we're talking about today. And these are worms that are in the Amynthas genus. So there's 2 different types. They are more or less the same type of characteristics. They just differ a little bit in size. And so one of these is Amynthas agrestis, and the other one is tokyoensis. These are also known as crazy worms, snake worms, or Alabama jumpers, I've even heard them called. They're non-native, basically meaning that they are not originally from the United States. They are native to Eastern Asia, and they're invasive. And so in this context, invasive means that they are not originally from the United States, and they cause harm in some kind of economic or ecological factor. So a little bit more about the life cycle of jumping worms. One thing to note is that they only live for 1 year. So this is what we call annual. This is different than, for instance, the common nightcrawler. The common nightcrawlers live 5, 7, as long as 10 years even. So they have a lot of energy that's going into just trying to live and overwinter so that they can continue their life. That's not necessarily the case with jumping worms. So what's important to know here, they're only alive for a year. So that means that they start really small, they grow really fast, and then they can throw all of that energy into reproducing and producing these eggs that are in the cocoons. Another thing to note here is that they're parthenogenetic, which just basically means that they can reproduce on their own. They essentially clone themselves. They do not need a mate to do this. So we'll talk about why that could be problematic in a little bit there. One thing I do want to note here is that I've got in the adults stage, September and October are circled in red because these are when adults are most active. And this is going to be the time that they're going to be the easiest to identify. And we'll get into identification in just a couple of slides here. But just important to note, if you're seeing a lot of worms come out in May or June and they're pretty big, it's probably not jumping worms because they're still relatively small during that time. They're juveniles. And they're also in their cocoons for half of the year. So from November to April, there are no adult jumping worms. The first frost more or less kills them. And the only thing that is remaining in their life cycle during that period of time is just the eggs inside of the cocoons. Where are jumping worms? They can be found in soil, leaves, compost, mulch garden beds, crop beds. In a forest setting, they're typically in the shaded areas or newly disturbed areas. So as far as where they're going and where they could be, they are invading areas around the globe. This includes North America, Central America, Europe, and Maine. So if we're looking at this chart here, this is from a scientific article from 2017. So it's a little dated, but I think it has an important message here. And so if you're looking at the dark gray regions, this is the potential range of these worms. And the white circles are confirmed cases where they are present. And again, this is from 2017, so it's a bit dated at this point. There are more instances of confirmed cases than is currently being reflected in the state of Maine. But it sort of gives you an idea about where they have the potential to be. So speaking of Maine, where are they found? They were found here in 2012, most notably. They're confirmed in 12 counties, potentially more than that. We had this graph created in January of this year, and I think that we are going through and confirming reports that we've got in the past couple of months or so. So it's possible that we might be adding more towns to this. That being said, it's not considered to be a widespread pest yet, but it is expanding. Let's see. I am hearing some feedback. I'm not sure if we could just make sure that we're muting ourselves. So you might be asking, where are jumping worms? Again, here, we know where they are in the state, but this is a really cool tool that's accessible. It's free, it's open access. You don't even need an account to log in. And this is called Immap Invasives. So if you wanted to go and check out maps like this, you can actually see where they are across the globe. It would be immapinvasives.org. And if you go into the section at the very top of the website, right under login, there's public map. It'll let you type in anything you'd like. You can filter records, and it's not even specific to jumping worms. It could be invasive species you're interested in, plants, anything like that. It's a really cool way to sort of bridge the gap between citizen scientists and researchers. It's free and open access data, so it's pretty neat. And this specific map is just showing where we have confirmed cases in the state of Maine. So how did they get here? They were likely imported on plants or other agricultural materials, and they're spread pretty easily. So things like community mulch piles, plotted plant sales, plant nurseries, composting, hiking boots, fishing, water flow even. So there's a lot of different ways that these can get around fairly quickly. So if you're thinking, oh, well, I thought earthworms were really good, and maybe, they help nutrients and the water and the soil, and they recycle organic matter, and they're food source. And I think that you're right. I think that those are good points. But I'd like to offer sort of a different viewpoint on the situation. Okay. So sometimes the bad outweighs the good. And if you're here, it might be because you've been hearing about jumping worms a lot in the media. It's sort of becoming a hot button topic at this point. There's a lot of people that are jumping on board and freaking out about it. And so while there is cause for some concern, there's still a lot that we don't know. So things like look out for jumping worms, and they're invasive and they're going everywhere and they're changing their world and it's going to damage all of our forests. This is what we think. They have the potential to do that, but we don't have any resources or literature that's supporting long-term results of them. That's what they're going to be doing. This is just hypothetical. They have the potential to do this. Again, they're pretty new here, so we're still trying to figure out what's going on and how we can best manage them. So again, keep in mind, we're still learning things. They are invasive, they are getting a lot of attention, but we're still trying to figure out how to best combat them. So my best word of advice, if you get anything out of this, just try not to panic, just do your best to stay informed. So with that being said, what can jumping worms do to our forests? And one of the important things to note here is that they really change the soil consistency. So these images are in areas where jumping worms have been confirmed. And so what they do to the top layers of the soil is they convert it into this coffee ground, taco meat, kitty litter kind of consistency, these little granules. You can imagine that this is not super ideal. And this happens because they are eating all of the soil and taking in all of the nutrients that are there. They do that very, very fast, and they just release these castings or these worm feces into the top layers of the soil. So we go from really normal, healthy, nutrient-rich soil to this very loose layer, and that can be really problematic. And something to note here, these jumping worms are considered to be epigeic, so they are on really the top 2 inches of the soil layer, and so that's why we're seeing soil that looks like this. Oh, and there goes my computer doing that again. Like, give me 1 second, just make sure that it's sharing the right screen, because I think it might have just switched it. Let's see. Amy, can you confirm if it's still sharing the right way?
It is not.
Okay. I don't know why it keeps doing that.
I think when it went black for a moment, I think it came back just fine.
Oh, okay. Well, let me try that again. Yeah. Apologies. I'm not sure why that keeps happening. It really doesn't do that.
Okay, you're good now.
Okay, we're good? Wow, I'm so sorry. Okay. So yeah, so they are epigeic, so they're on the top couple of inches of the soil there, and so that's why we're seeing this consistency there, because they're just constantly turning over these top layers. And so you might be thinking, why is loose soil bad? And there's a couple reasons for this. So if we're looking at this image on the left here, we have soil infested with jumping worms, and you can see the kitty litter, the sort of taco meat, just this very loose soil on the left side of this picture. And on the right side, there are no jumping worms there. So it's what you would consider normal soil. There's leaf litter layer. It's fairly healthy looking. There's not a lot of turnover here. And so with the soil infested with jumping worms, you have to start worrying about things like erosion, less nutrient-rich soil. Oftentimes, this soil is just coated in the worm feces, these casings. So often they're drier. And you have to remember too, soil is really important for plants and trees. And so when you have this sort of loose soil, it's really difficult for plants and trees to keep their roots in the ground and stay rooted and stay healthy and thrive in that way. So soil that is loose like this also potentially has threats toward native plants and trees. So this being said, this is a really good example of this type of erosion early on. So this was taken at Colgate University, where there are jumping worms in these garden beds. And so you can see after a rain event, it just washes right onto the sidewalk. So over time, you can imagine that this tree, the roots that are pretty well established into the ground might become starting to be exposed. Oh,
I can't make it loud.
There's still some feedback there. Okay, thanks, Amy. So you can imagine exposed roots could be bad for trees and plants. The soil can also become compacted over time, also not an ideal place for trees and plants to thrive. Furthering this point, cocoons can also be washed away to a new location. The cocoons are pretty lightweight. They're often made out of silk, and so they sort of float on the top and they can just kind of go to a new location, which you can imagine is also not super ideal. And so sort of digging into this point a little bit deeper for what is happening or what can happen to the woods here. If we're looking on the left side of this image, this is just lightly infested with a couple of worms. So you have things like plant diversity because there's a healthy leaf layer and there's tons of thick and spongy and lovely nutrient-rich soil that's there. We have our tree roots that are really deeply embedded into the ground with more or less undisturbed soil layers. And when you have things like jumping worms that can reproduce really quickly, and it only takes one jumping worm or one cocoon to start an entire population, you get this heavily infested area where they are eating so much of the soil and not providing a lot of nutrients back. So you're getting that kitty litter like soil layer on the top there. So that's not going to be the ideal location or environment for plants or trees, again, because it could erode away. We could see a lot of roots that are going to be coming up and being exposed, which is not super healthy for the tree. And we lose the leaf litter layer as well. So a lot of those good nutrients that our plants and trees thrive on, we now no longer have that. So you can imagine if we don't have something like that with our native plants and trees, that could affect what kind of insects are also visiting that forest. And it could also affect what kind of wildlife is going to be supported in that forest. Things that eat a lot of plants, deer or berries are really important for birds, and so things like that. So you can imagine how this might shift forest ecosystems. Another thing to note here is that when there's increased forest damage, so this being like an event in which the soil is all really loose, we're losing our native plants and we might lose some of our native trees. They're just not supported. What that means is that there's basically free real estate so that these invasive plants might be able to thrive a little bit better than our native plants. So we might see with increased forest damage, a correlation of increased invasive plant presence. So things like garlic mustard or Japanese barberry or glossy buckthorn might be in an environment where they can thrive a little bit more because there's no competition from any of our native plants or trees, or very little competition rather. And maybe these kinds of plants thrive in an environment where they don't really need the same nutrients as our native plants and trees. So I do have a star on the Japanese barberry, and that is, oh, it's again. Oh my goodness. So sorry. Amy, are we still sharing the right screen?
You are not.
Oh my goodness. If I could figure out how to make it not do that, I'd love to do that. But until then, we're just gonna stop sharing and then share again.
There you go.
Is it? It's good. Excellent. Cool.
Yep.
This is a testimony to all of my brain power here. So like I was saying, we've got a red star that's on Japanese barberry. And I've got that here because if you're not familiar with tick ecology or things related to that, ticks really thrive in the microclimate that Japanese barberry can create. And so if we have an area with a lot of Japanese barberry, that potentially or has the potential to support a lot of ticks in that area. So we could see things like increased Lyme disease incidence or something of that effect. And so, again, this is not something that we know definitively. It's just something that we can start to hypothesize and think more broadly about the larger picture that could be here. And so, you know, to the sort of, I thought earthworms were good question, there's a lot of effects that changing the soil has for a forest ecosystem. So things like I just mentioned, if we've got more invasive plants, we could have more ticks, which means we could have more Lyme disease incidence rates. So that affects human health. Or if we're changing the nutrients in the soil, like for instance, there's less nitrogen or less potassium or less calcium, or if these soils that are being dropped out, they're just the worm casings, they're not nutrient rich and they're often drier, we can start to look at things like drought or fire, which is going to, of course, alter forest biodiversity or forest productivity. The state of Maine's really known for logging. And so a lot of people rely on their woodlots for a source of income because they are selling their logs. And so you can start to see the effects on the environment and the economy. And so when I look at something like this, when you are having the potential to change the soil as much as you can in a forest setting, there's a lot of other things that might be, you should be taking into effect here. And again, this is not quite what's happening. It has the potential to happen. And so it's just interesting to think about the broader picture here. And so what can jumping worms do to our forest, sort of continuing on this point? Like I mentioned, they can reproduce on their own. So it only takes one jumping worm or cocoon to start a new population. And like I had mentioned previously, half the year they are cocoons, and the other half of the year they're really just eating enough so that they can reproduce, and then they'll die at that first frost. So they reach maturity really quick, which means that they can have more generations, more offspring. It's just kind of like a cascading effect here. And so they overwinter as eggs inside of these small cocoons, and these cocoons have a silk outer layer, and that protects them from cold and from drying out. And you can imagine with how small these things are. This is a picture comparing them to the size of a penny. They're really hard to detect. They look like soil, so they're really, really, really easy to spread. So arguably, the real problem here is actually cocoons. Not to say that jumping worms themselves are not the problem, but they're both the problem. But cocoons are way harder to try to combat here, more difficult rather. So again, they're really difficult to see. They're easily spread in things like soil, mulch, or potted plants. And this is going back to, it getting stuck in boots or tires or things like that. They look like dirt. So most of the times when it's spread to a new area, it's not an intentional thing. And so you might be thinking, okay, well, we live in Maine and it gets pretty cold, right? So maybe the cold could kill the cocoons. And I can see that thinking, but you also have to consider that when it gets really, really cold here, there's usually like a foot of snow on the ground, and snow is really insulative. So the ability for the cold seasons to Maine to actually penetrate and do anything to these cocoons, very minimal, again, because they're just going to be on the top layer of the soil, the top couple of inches. And so for the temperature to ever actually penetrate into the cocoon and cause any death, probably unlikely. There's also this issue of seed banking. And so this essentially just means that when mature worms are laying these eggs, these cocoons, not all of them are going to hatch that next year. Some of them will, some of them won't. So you can see that, there's sort of overlapping generations, and this might be a problem if you are trying to really reduce your populations. One year you might have a real reduction in that population, and then the next year you might change nothing, and there could be more or less depending on how many of these eggs are actually hatching. So also something to keep in mind. So sort of finishing this part off, earthworms are an invasive species. They have the potential to upset soil chemistry and nutrients. They can make it more difficult for native plants and insects to thrive, and they have the potential to alter forest ecosystems. And so this whole time you've probably been thinking, okay, but how can I identify them? And don't worry, we'll go over that. So first, what I want to do before we talk about jumping worm biology is talk about the common nightcrawler. And so these, typically when you think of earthworms, this is what comes to mind. And although they're roughly around the same length, 2 to 6 inches, there's some really stark differences that could be really key in identifying the two, or differentiating the two. So one of these things is called the clitellum, and that is going to be in the center of these worms. And if my laser pointer was working, I could maybe, oh, there it is. Yeah, so that is right here. So in the common earthworm, it is saddle shaped, which means that it doesn't wrap all the way around the worm. You can actually see the worm body kind of cutting through here. The clitellum of the common nightcrawlers is also raised. It's typically a pink color, and it's in the middle of the body. So it's on segments 32 to 37. So one segment would just be like one little section of here. And so it's more or less in the middle of the body. Another thing to note here is if these worms are really big, sometimes you can see these things called setae, or their hairs. These help with projecting the worm along, their movement a lot of times. And so in common nightcrawlers, they're what's considered widely paired. And so we have these pairs of these little hairs on, if this was a cross section of an earthworm, it would just be, on each quadrat of the earthworm. And so this is widely paired. And because they don't have a whole lot of setae, they're often pretty slow moving and shy and timid. That's not to say that earthworms can't be really fast moving, but oftentimes they are a lot more docile than the jumping worms. And so, for instance, here, comparatively, if we're looking at the jumping worm clitellum, it's typically much closer to the head, and so it's often found from segments 14 to 16. So if you're comparing that with the common earthworm, this is 32 to 37. This is much closer to the head, and that's important because sometimes the worm can really stretch out, and it's hard to really eyeball where the clitellum is in the worm, because sometimes it can look like it's in the middle. So if you can count segments or sort of estimate where that would be, that's a good way to identify. Other things are the color. So the clitellum also is milky white. It's not going to be that pink that's often on the earthworms. It's also smooth and flat, so it's not raised, and it fully encircles the worm. So unlike the clitellum of the common earthworm here, where it does not envelope and it looks like a horse saddle, the clitellum of the jumping worms is full. It's all the way around. The hairs are also different. So each segment has a bunch of setae. So you can see here that this is more of a bristle-like. So around the entire segment, there's bristles instead of the widely paired, just 4 pairs of the setae of the common nightcrawler. Another thing here is checking the behavior. And so they get their name jumping worms for a reason, right? So a lot of times you'll see thrashing or fast moving snake-like movements. They like to do this serpentine locomotion where they'll kind of flip their nose to their tail and kind of move like a snake. And oftentimes they're called jumping because if you have them in your hand, when they're doing that serpentine sort of nose to tail flip, they'll often pop out of your hand. And so they can't actually jump. They don't have hind legs or anything like that. But the way that they move often kind of looks like they're jumping. And the last thing is other species that are common in Maine often won't drop their tails when they're threatened, but the jumping worms will. And this is a defensive mechanism, just so that if they are being attacked by a bird or other predators, they can kind of just dislodge that tail. The predator will get distracted by the tail and it lets them get away. And a lot of the common earthworms that are in Maine don't typically do that. So if you are seeing this kind of behavior, that might be another indication that you might have jumping worms, or you might be looking at a jumping worm. So bottom line here, how can I help our forests? So the most important thing that you can do is arrive clean and leave clean. So cleaning soil and debris from vehicles, equipment, boots, other gear before arriving or leaving the hiking trails or forests, really, really key. There's this company called Play Clean Go, which actually create information on hiking trails, but they have an installed boot brush so that when you arrive at the hiking trail, you can clean off your boots. So things like cocoons, which look like dirt, have less of a chance of sticking to your boot and going with you to your home or to the next hiking trail that you're off to. If you don't have an area where you have these kind of boot brushes that are installed, which is often the case, you can purchase this yourself. I have one in my work truck that I use personally before I leave or enter a new spot, just to try to prevent any kind of introduction for the cocoons. This also works with other things too, like invasive plant species. So all around, just good to clean stuff before you bring it to a new location. The other thing that you can do is report suspected jumping worms to us. So this is our webpage. This is on the DACF Jumping Worms in Maine. This is where you can find a bunch of great information. And the report form is right on the top here underneath the featured links. And so you can click that. It'll give you a bunch of questions to answer. Most importantly, if you are going to report suspected jumping worms, please try to include some photos. That's really key for helping us to help identify it for you. And without photos, that's really tricky. So please, I strongly encourage you to use the form. And even if you're just not sure if it's a jumping worm or not, that's okay. We will check that out and investigate it for you. So there's no harm in submitting a report form just to be on the safe side. So far as management goes, it's really tricky. There's a lot that's going on. Again, this is still really, really new. We don't really know the long-term effects, and we're still trying to figure out what the best case scenario is for managing these kinds of things. One thing I will offer is that they are parthenogenetic. So again, they clone themselves. They don't need a mate, which means that there's fairly low genetic diversity. So in other terms, the way that you can think about this is like, let's say if I'm a jumping worm and I have a peanut allergy, right? And I clone myself and I have all of my offspring now also have peanut allergies. If scientists come along and they figure out like, oh, hey, peanuts work really well at killing these jumping worms, it's not only going to kill me, but it's going to kill all of my offspring and my offspring's offspring and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and you know, this is hypothetical. Peanuts, there's no such thing as a peanut allergy with worms, but it's sort of that kind of idea where if there's one gene that might be allowing scientists to sort of find something that they're a little susceptible to, a management solution's very likely to be effective for the majority of populations. So that being said, some things that we can do in the meantime is consider heat treatment. And so there is current research that suggests that these jumping worms will die at roughly about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and the worms and cocoons die at about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. But the catch here is that you really want to have this prolonged heat for more than 3 days. So if you have something like a raised garden bed with jumping worms, this is probably the best case scenario for trying to manage the jumping worms in that. So most importantly, you want to contain the soil. So if you're using something like a clear plastic cover over the topsoil of gardens and lawns that receive full sun, this will help raise the temperature in that soil. But if you're not containing the soil, the worms will just move away and you're just potentially harming whatever you're trying to grow in that bed. So, you know, you sort of have to think about the risks and the benefits to it. But more or less, if you can contain the soil, do that. So that when you put the clear plastic cover over it, it'll help get the soil to that hotter temperature and then help kill them. The other thing that you can do is if you can actively see the jumping worms when you're turning over a crop or anything like that, do with soil, you can pick them up, put them in a bag. You can leave them in the sun for a couple of days. Again, we're solarizing it, so we're getting the temperature in the bag hot enough to kill them. And then you can just keep that bag, tie it up, throw it in the trash. And so if we can reduce the amount of adults that are in an area, we can also, therefore, by proxy, reduce the cocoons in that area too. Another thing you can do is break up the top casting layer. That's like their ideal soil when it's like that kitty litter taco meat kind of consistency. That's what they like. And so if you can break that up and kind of mix it around, it'll make their life harder. And that's sort of what we aim to do here, is make it really hard for them. You might be thinking, okay, well, that's all fine and good, but what chemicals can I use for managing jumping worms? Fortunately, there are no products listed for use for management of jumping worms. I will say that using products for pests that are not listed on that label is not legal in the state of Maine. So again, here, research is effective on just trying to figure out what is going on, what will be most effective is ongoing. So I don't have a great answer for you now, but I'm very hopeful that in the near future, we will have some answers to manage this. So the number one thing that we can do in the meantime is, besides solarizing to try to kill what's already there, is just preventing it in the first place. So a big part of this is just knowing the signs. So educating yourself or your neighbors or others on recognizing what jumping worms themselves look like, what their cocoons look like, what the soil characteristics of jumping worms look like, are all helpful to try to prevent the spread. You can also do this by monitoring for jumping worms. So you can rake up that leaf layer to see where the worms are, and just to get a good idea of what they look like so that you can ID them or submit a report to us if you can't figure it out. And the other thing is a mustard solution, which is something that I will get into in just a couple of slides here. The other things that you can do here is be a worm-wise buyer. So you don't want to be buying jumping worms for bait or composting or gardening. And if you do buy worms, as long as you can positively identify that they are not jumping worms, that's your own prerogative, but don't specifically seek out jumping worms for the purpose of using them as fishing bait or composting. On that same note, if you are going to be buying other things like soil, compost, or mulch, make sure that you're checking these things for signs of jumping worms or cocoons. And if you're buying these things from plant nurseries, it would be an important question to ask if they heat treat their soil or their compost or their mulch. And if they don't, I maybe wouldn't consider purchasing things from them. You could also ask plant nurseries what they do to prevent jumping worms or what they've been doing to start the conversation, and hopefully they'll have some reassuring things to say to you. The other thing here, choosing bare root plants over potted plants when possible. And this is because those cocoons, again, they look like soil. And so just a little clump of soil just sticking to the bottom of a root plant could cause an entire population. So if we are just cleaning those bare roots or buying bare roots, that would be the best case scenario. Of course, we can't always do that because there are some plants that would be really sensitive to that. But when you can choose bare root over potted. And another one, this seems sort of obvious, but we're just gonna clean everything, clean absolutely everything. So this includes gardening tools. If you're helping your neighbor plant some stuff and then you go back to your house, you just never know. I would just clean all of it and make sure that when you are cleaning it, especially if you're in an area that has suspected jumping worms, don't clean it off and just let the soil hit the ground. You want to really clean it off in a contained area so that you can solarize that, that bucket or that tarp or whatever it is that you're cleaning it off on, so that if there are cocoons present, you're killing them instead of just, washing them off into whatever you are washing them underneath. On the same note here, landscapers or logging workers, if they're doing work on your property, you can absolutely ask them to clean their equipment. Or if you have active jumping worm infestation, that would also be something to let them know about so that they know to clean their equipment before they go to the next customer. Of course, I sort of touched on this, just rinsing roots to remove those soil clumps. What you can do is just take the plant, remove that soil again in a contained sort of like a 5-gallon bucket from Home Depot is fine. You're just going to want to remove those soil clumps, place those clumps into a trash bag in the sun before you just toss them out. And this is just to make sure that if there are cocoons present, we're not spreading those to areas we don't mean to. So if you think that you might have jumping worms, you can call us or you can send a report and we can help you identify the worms. I said this already, but please don't panic. The number one thing that we can do now is just stay informed and just focus on preventing their spread to other areas on your property. And so that being said, if you suspect that you obtained worms from compost or potted plants, please reach out to that location you think you might have got them from. You can also reach out to Gary Fish. I think I saw him on this call. He is amazing and he is the Maine State horticulturist. And this is his contact information, email or phone call. And he would be a great resource as well. So what is the state doing? So it's important for me to also say that jumping worms are not currently regulated in Maine. So the DACF can't take action beyond education and outreach. And that's what I'm doing today is education and outreach. Further than that, we're working with multi-agencies. We've got working group with folks from the University of Massachusetts, Cornell, the University of Vermont, and Yale University. To try to figure out the best way to tackle this, to get the information out there, to try to figure out management strategies or different methods of some kind of management. Because of course, like I mentioned before, it's a hot button topic. A lot of people are talking about it, and it's unfortunate because we don't have a lot of the answers to it yet. So one of the things that I'm doing is a surveillance study. And this is going to be taking place later this month into September because I'm looking for adults. And so part of this surveillance is going to be trying to figure out where the jumping worms are located in the state of Maine. So the way that I'm doing this and the way that you can also do this, if you'd like to see if you have jumping worms or any kind of worms on your property, you take ground mustard, something like this can of Coleman's mustard, and you mix it with a gallon of water. And it's important, you can't just buy like the French's like mustard that you'd put on a hot dog. It has to be ground mustard because it's more concentrated. And so you basically mix that up. I'm going to put mine in a gardening can and just water down a quad rat. And what happens is that the the outer layer of the worms are really sensitive to things like mustard, and so they don't like that. They're going to try to wiggle away. So they will wiggle to the surface, and that's a good opportunity to sort of check and look into what worms come to the surface. And that would be when you're IDing them, trying to figure out what's going on in that area. And so I will be doing this, and I'm prioritizing newly disturbed areas, so like new construction sites. Again, because what often happens is they're incidentally introduced. So cocoons sticking to something like tires or boots, especially if these folks are going from location to location, and nobody's cleaning their equipment or their boots or things like that. It's very easy for these things to spread. So I'll be looking at stuff like disturbed areas, transfer stations would be another one, or even fishing areas that border forested edges, because sometimes jumping worms or other worms are mislabeled as red wigglers or other things that are often used as bait, usually accidentally. And so it's just important to check those areas too, because we don't want people to dump their fishing bait and then it turns out it's jumping worms and now it's in the forested edge and nobody knows about it. So really, this is just trying to survey parts of the state to try to figure out where their upper and lower limits are currently. And I should say that this is, if you want to use this in your garden, this is not likely to harm your plants. There's been a lot of research done on this kind of thing, unless your plants are really, really, really susceptible to this kind of thing. Maybe I wouldn't do it then, but for the most part, it's unlikely to harm plants or any of the microclimate in those beds. So it should be okay, but use your own discretion. And again, this is just for detection. This is not going to control the worms. It's not going to kill them. It's just enough to irritate them so that they wiggle to the surface so that we can try to figure out and ID them and see how many there are. So there is an opportunity to learn more about this. Again, this is our homepage on jumping worms in Maine. There's lots of good resources here if you haven't checked it out. Some of them are under that featured links bar on the right side of the page. Again, we have contacts for Gary on this page as well, and the jumping worm report form. And with that said, I will end there. And this is a QR code. So this is a real quick way to get that report form if you wanted to see what it looked like or even fill one out. You can just scan this using your camera app on your phone, and it'll bring you right to the actual survey. So that being said, I apologize for all of the technical difficulties that I was having during that, but I'm more than happy to answer some questions in the chat, and I see that there's been some questions that have been asked and possibly answered. So there's so many. Okay. So yeah, let me go ahead and see the chat for a little bit here, unless anyone has questions they would
Brittany,
like to ask.
I think I've answered pretty much all the questions.
Oh,
in the
great.
chat.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you so much for doing that, Gary. I super appreciate that. Like I said, Gary's a fantastic resource. Were there any other questions?
Hi, Brittany. I have a question for you. Wondering since well, I can hear my echo. This is really difficult.
Oh, yeah.
But
I think I found it.
Yeah, since the cocoons are laid about a couple inches of soil, and if we have them in our raised bed gardens, would it be a good way to remove the cocoons if you dug out the first couple inches of soil in a raised bed garden in the fall, for instance? Yeah,
so you're right. The cocoons are typically going to be where the adult worms are, which is going to be in the first 1 to 3 inches of the layer of the soil. And so if you wanted to remove that soil and heat treat it or remove it in some capacity, it could work, but I would just caution that it's very easy to miss these things. There's also precautions about cleaning all of the things that it could potentially touch. So buckets, tarps, shovels, anything like that, you're going to want to fully clean off if this was something that you're going to do. And right now, the only way that we can kill the cocoons that our research supports right now is that solarization process. And so if this is something that you wanted to do in the fall, I'm not necessarily sure if you'd be able to kill the cocoons that way. But if I'm understanding your question correctly, it's not necessarily that you want to solarize, it's just that you want to completely remove the soil layer altogether. Is that right?
Yeah, if it would remove the soil and put it in a bag and just kind of let it and be in the sun for a while to kill the cocoons.
Yeah, you certainly could. I would just again, besides the cautions of making sure that all of the equipment is clean, we want to make sure that it is above 104 degrees Fahrenheit for a number of days. So fall might be tricky to get that temperature that hot, especially since you really have to leave it out in the full sun. And if you've got a huge bag, I wonder about how hot you can actually get the lower layers of the soil if it's just standing there. You can certainly try it. I don't think that there's any harm in that, but again, just make sure that everything is clean.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. I'm just trying to see if there are any other questions in the chat here. Not here. Oh, Amy, you're raising your hand?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, well, I'm kind of a nutcase in a way, but we've had jumping worms for a number of years, mostly in our vegetable garden. And I can't emphasize enough how they have changed the quality of the soil. And last year, I didn't even garden in there because we were trying to get rid of them. And we didn't have a lot of luck. I understand that maybe we should have used clear plastic instead of black plastic, and that might have been better. I did take soil temperatures on numerous occasions and found that it was up to over 104 degrees. But very soon, as you went down further into the soil, that didn't hold true anymore. So do you turn it over? It's really a problem this year with all the rain. The soils have stayed wet. That's actually a good thing, because when these castings dry out, they turn into dust, and then water just rolls right off of it, and you can't really even wet the soil. I mean, it really is a gardening nightmare. So people that are listening, if you find one, get rid of it. Dig around there, get rid of as many as you can. I don't know what else to do. And honestly, it has changed my whole attitude towards gardening in a big way. Our vegetable garden is ruined, and I don't know what to do about it. So good luck, everybody.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to hear that. I know it's a really frustrating thing, and especially because there's not a lot of good management options. It's incredibly frustrating, and I certainly hear you on that. As far as the solarization goes, you absolutely bring up a good point in that when you have a sort of clear plastic and you're hopefully using the sun to heat it up in the bed, you really want direct sunlight to really help it cook. And in Maine, we definitely have temperatures that will allow for that process to happen, especially with the aid of that clear plastic tarp, again, to try to keep that heat in and keep it hot. And so you will kill some of the cocoons that way, and certainly the worms will only really thrive in temperatures lower than 85 degrees. So if you wanted to try to kill the cocoons that might be in the lower layers where maybe they're not reaching the 104 above temperatures, you could consider turning it over as long as you're making sure that those top layers are reaching that hot temperature that we want. Again, I still caution the same thing with whatever you're using to turn it over. You really want to make sure that you're cleaning everything fully. You don't want any cocoons to be left over. So it's certainly an option, but a tricky one. Yeah, and I see, Gary, you have your hand up. I'm not sure if you have things to add as well.
Yeah, I would just add that in the research trials that Joseph Gores has done at UVM, he really hasn't been able to get control at all by trying to solarize in the ground, because the worms just flee and move away from the area that's being heated. So if you're going to try to do that, you almost have to contain the worms somehow. So the person that was bagging the soil, that's probably really the only way to do it, but it's a lot of work. and it's not going to be foolproof. You know, you're going to miss some cocoons or something like that. And it's unfortunate that we don't really have any good management methods for this at this point. They've been trying a lot of different things, and they really just don't work up to this point. And I think that we all have to be patient and try to work with it as best we can and not try to panic too much about it. I think that eventually there will be a management method that will be available. And, hopefully that'll come in the next few years. It's certainly something that a lot of universities are working on now. A lot of people are concerned about it. So the word is out and the research is hopefully getting done.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Let's see. Just trying to monitor the chat here. Okay, so we have a question. I've noticed robins eat them like crazy. Can birds spread cocoons with their droppings? If the robins are eating the worms, the worm will die in the digestive system of that robin. And so the worm itself is not, once it's excreted from the robin, that is just worm, guts from whatever the robin is going to excrete out is not going to cause any issues. The cocoons are formed from the actual worm itself. It's sort of the clitellum sort of creates like a little slime ball, and then it can self-fertilize itself. And so if you kill the worm by digestive enzymes or anything like that, where the worm has to get broken up in some capacity, there's no real threat for any of the bird excrement to be passing along something like a cocoon. It just wouldn't be able to fertilize in the stomach of a bird. So I would say not so much. Yeah. Let's see. When and where will the recording be available? The recording will be available sometime next week. It'll be on our YouTube page. I think, and Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, is it just the DACF YouTube page that this will be posted to?
I think it will be the Maine Forest Service YouTube
Maine
page.
Forest Service. Okay, yeah. So just if you are familiar with YouTube, you can type in Maine Forest Service jumping worms. Within the next week or so, we should have that up for you to be able to watch the whole thing. And again, I apologize that my computer was going back and forth so many times. Let's see. Just making sure I didn't miss anything here. Gary, thanks so much. You've been such a help with answering all of these.
You did a super job, Brittany.
Thanks so much. Let's see. Were there any other questions that maybe I missed? Okay, there's a lot in the chat. Oh, I see Ivy has their hand up, so go ahead. Or maybe not.
It looks like Amy has her hand up again, or unless that's still from the previous question.
Yeah, that's still from the previous question, I guess.
Oh, okay.
I will just add one further observation. Read the looseness of the quality of the soil. In the rain, a lot of the taller plants like Brussels sprouts have toppled over, and I've never noticed that really before in such a way. So again, the soil texture and quality is just not the same at all. Yeah. And I guess, I don't know whether this is a help at all, but if anybody from your department would like to come and look at this, in some places, I mean, all I have are worm castings. So it's, free samples. Come and get them and, test them, whatever. Yeah. So let me know.
Yeah. Just curious, did you send a report form with that? Amy, I think you might have been muted again, but if you didn't send a report form, we'd certainly love to see pictures of it.
Okay, I will do that. I just said that I've been communicating with Gary Fish for a number of years.
Okay.
And I certainly appreciate all of his help.
Yeah.
Tremendously also.
Yeah.
I'll
Gary's
send
great.
in a picture. Yeah, I will send in some pictures.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's see. Any natural insect predators? That's a great question. So with non-native and invasive species, it's really tricky to see what will actually eat these things because they didn't grow up together. They didn't evolve together. So when you have something that's invasive and not native to an area, all of the native insects and wildlife, birds and things like that, don't really know how to interact with it. And so they might, birds might see a worm and might go for it. Same with snakes and other things that eat worms. But as far as any insect predators, there's none that I know off the top of my head. I see Gary's throwing in some sources in the chat. I'm not sure if that's related to this or not, but to my knowledge, I do not know of any natural insect predators.
No, I don't think that they really know.
Can I jump in here for a minute?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
I noticed several years ago, wild turkeys were getting into our garden. This was before I knew we had a problem. And they were scratching very vigorously in the pathways. And I just, I guess they were getting something out of there. So it's very possible that they were somehow cued into the availability of a lot of worms there. This we noticed for quite a while, but that was just they never came back the next year or this year. And there are plenty of jumping worms in that path. I did hear that they bioaccumulate arsenic or maybe other heavy metals. So it's not recommended that you feed them to chickens or other livestock. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I did read that somewhere.
Yes, that's correct. They do bioaccumulate because they are eating all of these things that are in the soil, especially with Maine soils. There's things like mercury and arsenic and other heavy metals that they can bioaccumulate. So you're absolutely correct. So if you have a large population of jumping worms, you might think, oh, I'll just feed it to my chickens. I would say not so. I would not recommend doing that, especially if you plan on eating those chickens. Or if you care about the well-being of those chickens, certainly wouldn't do that because of the bioaccumulation. You're going to expose them to these heavy metals that are not going to be beneficial. Yeah, absolutely. Were there any other questions? It looks like we're kind of winding down, and I do see that we're a minute over, so I just want to be cognizant of everyone's time.
Yeah, I know that people have been asking about nursery BMPs, and I can't seem to get them to paste into the chat. So if somebody wants me to send them a copy of the nursery BMPs, just email me at gary.fish@maine.gov, and I'll send those off.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I will just again thank you everybody for attending. I hope this was informative. If there's any other questions, please feel free to send me an email, send Gary an email. Again, you can use our report form that's for the jumping worms on the screen here. Thanks for attending. Thanks for your patience through all of the technical difficulties. Once again, I apologize for that. And that being said, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'm just going to go ahead and end the meeting for everyone. Thanks for coming.